And this is the first time we've ever been able to play it at a Hyde band because like the parts are so intricate and things like this. So I hope you enjoy this. It's Overture to the Major Figure Out. Well, okay, we'll do it then. We'll do it. So, this song is Pirates of the Caribbean.
you for around 2 to 3 years to remember the time you could barely make a single note come out. But look at here we are all, and thanks to you, our pillar of support, and through all the feedback, we have become the strongest band. Every moment is a gift that we cherish, and as many of us graduate today, moving beyond just our musical adventures, we will never forget the valuable lessons you taught us, Mr. Shimatsu. Thank you for being the best band director our high class could ever ask for. Thank you.
The former CEO of one of the biggest tech companies in the world. I like these words that being in Mr. Shimatsu's class, which taught me that to review about something important to you have to step outside of your comfort zone. It was only 3 years ago that I was a sixth grader, too shy and too scared to speak up in class or to play a single note during check off. But Mr. Shimatsu was patient with those who weren't quite ready to put themselves out there. Over time, I improved only because of the encouragement I received from my teacher and my classmates. Being in Mr. Nishimatsu's class not only improved my musicality, but also my character and my confidence. So thank you, Mr. Nishimatsu, for giving us a space where we can learn and grow on our own pieces. We are so grateful for the music and memories we got to make, both inside and outside when we were 8th grade.
Good evening, everyone. My name is Richard, and I've been part of the Hyde Middle School game for 3 amazing years. I still remember my very first day of band practice, mainly because I spent half of it picking up my notes on the floor, and the other half was just me trying to figure out how to put the notes to. But through all the missed notes, drop sticks, and slightly chaotic errors, there was one person who never gave up on me or any of us, and that's Mr. Shimatsu. I want to thank Mr. Shimatsu for being more than just a teacher. He's been a coach, a guide, and sometimes a mentor. He's helped turn our noise into real music, and taught us how to play as a team, even when our instruments weren't exactly cooperating. His dedication, his patience, and his sense of humor have made this band not just a group, but a family. And tonight, as we play this concert, we want to say a big thank you from the bottom of our musical hearts. So please join me in giving him a huge round of applause.
So, Mr. Shimatsu was probably the best thing that ever entered my life. When I started in 7th grade at intermediate band, I was so cocky, and I didn't realize that I needed someone to teach me about music, and I thought that I had learned it all. But when Mr. Shimatsu taught me that it was important to be humble, and that you should always strive to be the best person that you can be, and I'm really grateful that he taught me those lessons. Thank you, Mr. Shimatsu.
So now we have some gifts we would like to give for Mr. Shimatsu. So
Thank